finish what you started, you came to the right place. Them girls that you came with, you might have to part with. Depending on how this thing shakes. Wauwatosa, Kenosha, Oconomowoc is in the house.
Another episode of the New Look, which is a reference that most people have been asking me about, but our guest today will surely get because he's schooled in the ways of Eisenhower. So New Look is both a reference to Northeast Wisconsin, NEW, and Eisenhower's grand strategy, the New Look. We are lucky today to be taking a new look at Navy issues and strategic issues more broadly with Captain Jerry Hendrix. Jerry, how are you?
I'm good, and I love that phrase. And of course, as an Eisenhower aficionado myself, I like the look.
Where are we talking to you today? Are you in your bunker in DC somewhere, or you have a very nice library?
Yeah, this is actually my my live-in home closet that I work out of, and so I have sort of two offices. One is sort of a larger library in the house, but I like to actually work in confined spaces, and so I have this space in here where I have all the books with me that I need at fingertip touch, and I have my computer set up in here, and this generally where I write from.
So, though you are you're currently residing in the greater DC area, you are a Midwesterner at heart. Tell us a little bit about where you're from and how your Midwestern roots shape you to this day.
Oh, that's great. I appreciate that question because it's when I get up in the morning and I look in the mirror, I don't see sort of a defense analyst or anything. I still see a farmer from Indiana. I grew up on a dairy farm in northeastern Indiana and milked Holstein cows with my dad from the time I was 3 years old and until the time I went off to Purdue University. And I still go home to the family farm. My dad still lives there. And in fact, I was on the phone with him just the other day as he was repairing fences that the horse had trod down in the lower part of the barnyard. So at 77 years old, he's still getting it done. So that's my outlook is an outlook of a Midwestern farmer. I did go to Purdue. I got a commission through the Navy ROTC program, and then was in the Navy for 26 years and flew P-3s as I was a naval flight officer. So I was the weapon systems as well as the navigator on board that aircraft. But I also became an analyst over time and went back to school on several occasions, as you have. And actually got a couple masters and then ultimately my doctorate looking at Theodore Roosevelt and his use of the Navy. So it's been a long path for me, but at heart, I'm still a Midwesterner. I married literally the girl that was 8 miles downriver from the creek that ran through my farm. And we started dating because we both love fishing and we still do. And our children love to fish as well.
Wow. So in your Navy career, you talked about also pursuing some academic opportunities that I think are really unique, or at least in the Marine Corps would be unique. I think the Navy does a far better job at allowing officers to pursue those. How did that work? Were you able to take time away to get your PhD done, or did you have to do it while you were working? How did the Navy allow you to pursue those opportunities?
Well, it's funny because at the time I was coming through, it wasn't that the Navy really allowed me. In fact, in many ways, I was discouraged to go back and do education, but it was something that really drove me. I finished up my first tour in P3s and had a chance to either go to Jacksonville and be an instructor in sort of what we call the FRS Fleet Replacement Squadron. But I was also offered a set of orders to go to the Naval Postgraduate School, which I leapt at and took, which was viewed as a step back in my career. But I enjoyed it. It was 18 months, did my first master's degree looking at history and national security in Northeast Asia, where I looked at the development of Japanese militarism over time, and really fell in love with sort of the academic aspect. I came back, went to the aircraft carrier, sort of repaired my career, as it were, by getting a breakout tour there. But I had a chance later to go into the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard as a federal executive fellow. And I doubled down and got a master's degree while I was there to sort of maximize my time at Harvard University. And then ultimately that segued in an opportunity for me to do my PhD at King's College in London. and which I did. I actually wrote my dissertation at sea while I was the XO of my squadron, and then actually did my defense of my dissertation while I was the commanding officer of a squadron. But I did that essentially in stride. I didn't take time away from my career to do that. I did that while I was at sea.
Well, I think the British system is perfect in that regard because, in contrast to the American academic system, you don't have as many course requirements, but you have to write a legit dissertation, and everything, as I understand it, hinges on that dissertation defense, which you said was on Theodore Roosevelt and his use of the Navy. Is that right?
Yeah, so it was essentially, the dissertation was on Theodore Roosevelt's use of the Navy as an instrument of coercive diplomacy. So, as an academic to an academic, it was a spin-off from Alexander George's work on coercive diplomacy. And I used Roosevelt, 4 case studies from him. And then when I finished that, I converted that over to a book, which I published 10 years ago on Theodore Roosevelt's naval diplomacy. Which is still out there, and I still get some interesting feedback on that. But that really colored how I began to view the Navy and its role in the world, and the idea that the Navy has to be present, that it has this influence or this presence in the world to uphold U.S. interests. And that really began me down a different path where I began to analyze the use of naval force structure as part of American diplomacy. And that's really what I've been working on for the last decade.
So 2 related questions. One, behind you, is that a Star Wars X-Wing helmet or a helmet you wore while you were a naval aviator? And by extension, and secondarily, what is the best assignment you had in your long career?
Oh gosh, that's such, I only had, I think, one bad tour in my entire Navy career. Yes, that actually is my helmet from Patrol Squadron 10. That's the one I wore into Desert Storm in 1991. And actually, up above me on this side, right up here, is my VP-8 helmet that I wore in 1999 through 2001 when I went back for a second tour in flying. But I enjoyed my flying tours. In my first tour, it was at the end of the Cold War, and I tracked legitimately Russian submarines. We had just finished the Cold War. The Russians were still out. They were still competing hard. They were trying to keep up at that point in time. And I got on top of a couple of Russian advanced submarines at that time, was able to track them, and really enjoyed that mental chess game between me as a relatively junior officer in the Navy and a senior Russian captain who was very experienced with a good crew and a good boat. That was a lot of fun. I had a great time being a tactical action officer on board the USS Theodore Roosevelt, and did 2 carrier tours, both times in support of combat operations as the ship's TAO. And then, I've had a number of just wonderful tours inside the Pentagon working on analysis. And of course, as you know, I got to finish out my career as the director of naval history because someone found out I had a dissertation and I had a PhD. And there were some issues going on at the Naval History and Heritage Command, and so I was verbally ordered by the Secretary of the Navy to proceed there and sort of correct some deficiencies.
Was that at Annapolis or in the Pentagon?
That's at the Washington Navy Yard.
Okay.
But we had 9 museums spread across the country, over 187,000 artifacts. I had 18,000 lineal feet of archival documents. There was something, to a tune of about $2 billion worth of old antique oil paintings that were under our care. And so I got to spend 2 years as the curator for the Navy and director of naval history. Wonderful job. But ultimately, when it came to retire, I wanted to get back to working on strategy and analysis. And that's what I've been doing for about the last 6 years.
That's to me, as an introvert and a navalist, that sounds like secretly the best job in government that you could possibly have.
I had a lot of people ask me why did I retire and why did I leave that job? And the question was that going to be my life's work, or was there something else to do? And I had to make the decision that there was something else I wanted to do.
Didn't you also work for Andy Marshall at Office of Net Assessment? And let me extend that question to, who do you consider your mentors throughout your career?
Great question. I've been blessed to have several mentors. So I had a great first commanding officer in my first squadron who continues to be a friend and mentor to me today, who really taught it was to be an officer and to compete against yourself, don't get caught up in a competition with everyone else. Compete against yourself. I did have a chance. I met Jim Stavridis when I was a lieutenant, and he was a 1-star at that point in time, and he really encouraged me to think and write more. Later, I had a chance to work for Andy Marshall, which is, when you walk in and you start working with this 90-year-old man who is already a legend, and that this is a historic figure. When you're a historian and you're working for a man that is a historical figure who will be written about in the way that like George Kennan is written about, then that you have to set aside that awe, because every day you actually have to go to work and you got to work for the guy and you got to get the job done. But he was
Wisconsin native George Kennan. You have to qualify that.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, actually, he's occupies that back shelf in the back of this thing. There's a whole Kennan shelf there. But yeah, working for Andy was fantastic. It was like a 2-year advanced graduate degree. And then, I've just been so blessed to work with other leaders, but including some of my, good friends like Rear Admiral Montgomery, who I roomed with, is another person that I consider not only a friend, but a mentor as well.
Great man. I just did a hearing with him this morning. Just final question on the kind of origin story portion of this podcast. So you mentioned that you went to Purdue on a ROTC scholarship. So at what point did you know that you didn't want to follow, in the family business of farming? Where do you think you got that bug for service or foreign policy, or kind of how do you think about that?
So two interesting things about that. One is, I grew up and I had a reading bug. And I love to read books, and I was reading all the time, and I really had a great interest in history and biography in particular, which my parents encouraged in me. I will tell you, I was in the barn and in the milking parlor one night, and we were milking the cows, my dad and I, and in between taking off the milkers and bringing in the next 3 cows, in that cycle, I would have a book there, and I would be reading a book in the barn. And one night, my father looked at me and he said, if you could ever find a job that paid you to read books, you'd be a millionaire. And essentially that lit a light into my head about, that's actually the ideal job for me. So I was blessed that I have a stepfather and a dad, served in the Navy and in the Army, and that national service was always an assumed part of my family upbringing. It was not a question of if I would serve, it would be what service that I would go into. And I made the choice to go Navy because I literally wanted to see the world. I wanted to get on ships. I wanted to fly airplanes. And that was a childhood dream. And so I went to Purdue with the idea of becoming a naval aviator. Because of my eyes, I was a backseater, but I did get a chance to sail the oceans of the world and see the things I wanted to do. The big issue was my decision to stay in. Originally, I thought I was going to get out and go back home to Indiana, but both my wife and I sort of fell in love with the idea of service. It was a vocation and not a job. It was something I was called to do. And so it was my pleasure and my honor to continue to serve up until 26 years. And really, we got out at that point because I realized that I had done about as much as I could there. And there were things I wanted to work on that I could only do from outside the Navy in a civilian suit.
So that's a perfect transition point. You are perhaps the most prolific writer on naval issues, or part of a group of about 3 people that are writing on these issues and arguing with each other a lot, that I follow and rely upon for advice. Let's talk about ships. Maybe we start, Jerry, with I'm coming to you from Green Bay, Wisconsin. We have a shipyard nearby in Marinette, and we recently got some good news that we won the competition for the Future Frigate. Maybe help the citizens of Northeast Wisconsin understand why this is important, not only from the immediate economic impact around here, but what role you see this Future Frigate playing in the future naval fleet.
Great question, and one that, quite frankly, has interested me for the better part of a decade now. And again, coming out of the research I had done on Theodore Roosevelt and his upbuilding of the fleet, which is his term, upbuilding of the fleet at the beginning of the 20th century, one of the things that Roosevelt focused on was the need for a balanced fleet. And he recognized as he was leaving office and turning over to William Howard Taft that it wasn't balanced. And so his injunction to Taft as he was leaving was to make sure that we added the proper number of ships in what was the lower end, the cruisers, the destroyers, destroyer escorts at that time. And Roosevelt had this thought of this pyramid of the fleet. You had battleships, and then you would have like 2 cruisers to battleship, and you'd have destroyers in a certain ratio, because we recognized that you could not build a fleet of entirely of battleships. And so there was the idea of high-low mix within that. So I brought that forward and started to look at that analytically when I was working in OSD policy in 2008. And what I recognized was that the Navy, and largely the U.S. government writ large, after the Cold War, had begun to invest heavily into high-end assets. The idea that we were supreme and there was no one really challenging us allowed us to really just build towards the high end. But we were beginning to vacate the lower end, the areas of the world where we had other interests. But if you run short on ships, for instance, when we got less than 300 ships, suddenly we began to vacate these areas of the oceans where we had defined interest, but we just didn't have enough ships to send them there on a regular basis. And we were decommissioning our frigates, the Oliver Hazard Perry class frigates, at an accelerated pace. And I could see this inflection point coming where we were going to begin creating a vacuum in certain key regions of the world. And the problem, and you know this, Mike, is that when you create a vacuum, vacuums get to be filled. And sure enough, when we started to not visit places like South China Sea or the East China Sea or the Arctic, North Atlantic, or the Baltic, then suddenly Russia steps up or China steps up, and they begin to fill that vacuum. They want to create a sphere of influence. And what we know is that spheres become increasingly unstable, and spheres actually lead to war because of the instability that comes with them. So I began to write about the need for a high-low mix. I began to talk about influence squadrons. I was trying to find a justification at the time for how we could most effectively use the new littoral combat ships that were coming out of our shipyards. But I also began to recognize that LCS wasn't going to solve all of our problems, that we needed sort of, a middle infielder, more of a utility player that traditionally had been filled by frigates. And so I began to advocate for a return to a frigate within the U.S. Navy, something that could do anti-submarine warfare as well as anti-surface warfare and provide much needed convoy escorts, which is something that is actually fairly specialized to be able to steam at that rate of speed and escort surface ships like combat logistics ships across the Atlantic Ocean or across the Pacific Ocean. So that's where I started to write, and I began that in 2009, beginning to talk about bringing back frigates, and it's been a decade. So now finally we've had the selection, and the selection is the FREM design that was offered by Fincantieri Marinette Marine, and so we will get these first 10 ships up and going, and hopefully we will build a lot more of them, because the actual number we require is much more in excess of the 10 to 20 ships that we're talking about right now.
So I guess the simplest way to put it would be these are ships that can go places that the higher end assets, destroyers and carriers can't go. So they allow us to fill those vacuums and show the flag and do presence operations. And theoretically, particularly as we start to ramp up production, they should be cheaper than those other high-end assets, which hopefully would allow us to have more ships overall, correct?
That is correct. And in fact, there's 2 things I want to tease out from what you just said. It's not just that they will be able to go places that other ships can't go, in the sense of being able to maintain constant presence in clear areas of competition like South China Sea or the Baltic. But it's actually technically that they're able to pull into ports that no other ship in our inventory can, because they're smaller, they have shallower draft, and so they can access sort of these medium and small size ports around the world that, quite frankly, since we've gone to sort of high-end, larger combatant ships, we've stopped visiting some of those. So my point here is this is going to allow us to really play a much broader field and have a level of engagement with other nations and other local populations in a way that we haven't been able to do really over the last decade.
So why do you think our design, the FREM, won? I mean, we were up against some stiff competition beyond the fact that Wisconsin's the best and we have the best workers in the Midwest. What do you think it was that put us over the top?
Well, if I did sort of an article a couple of years ago where I handicapped the frigate competition. And, first of all, I think the Navy had become less than enamored with aluminum hull constructions. So I thought that if the Navy was going to be satisfied with aluminum construction, that we wouldn't have even had a frigate competition to begin with. So I sort of discounted that. My thought is that the National Security Cutter, which I believe was the Huntington Ingalls entry, that it had inherent limitations because it was designed to be a Coast Guard national security cutter, and so that it wasn't going to be optimal for the frigate mission, which is ASW, ASUW, and convoy escort. That design was built with a certain bias towards the national security littoral patrol that the Coast Guard does for law enforcement. I will tell you that the Spanish entry that was done with Bath Iron Works in Maine, I think it's a very fine frigate. I also thought it was going to come in as being far too expensive. It was probably the most technically advanced from the sense of it had integrated Aegis combat systems already in it, but I thought it was going to come in well north of the price break that we were looking for. And so as I looked at the competition, I really saw FREM, which is a very mature design. There's already 10 to 12 ships in the water. It's being used by 4 other navies of the world. We know essentially what it costs to build, and we also know what it costs to maintain. And it has probably the biggest margins for growth with regard to electrical power, as well as adding additional combat systems to it. So I really had handicapped it as the clear leader, and I was pleased to see that the Navy agreed. So it was sort of a delight to me.
At a broader level, I think there's a lot of Wisconsinites that look back on, let's go all the way back to World War II and the day of Freedom's Forge and our ability to ramp up dramatically the production of ships and bombers and, XYZ. Why do you think it's so hard for us to do something similar today? What is standing in the way of our rapid march within a decade towards that goal, which is officially part of U.S. law now, of a 355 ship Navy?
Well, I think that your problem comes down to the level of bureaucracy that's grown up over the last 70 years. I love the Miller book, Freedom's Forge, and what we were able to do and how we would write contracts to build 50 ships, and Henry Kaiser would just go out and do it. And he would build a new shipyard and just, cut in the slips and start building ships on it. We don't have that ability to cut the red tape and go direct to production. There's also an issue in that the ships that we have today are much more technically complex. For instance, I was sort of surprised when the Navy made the frigate have a requirement to integrate a 3D air search radar. That's an air defense, air warfare radar. That's not a mission that's normally assigned to a frigate. That is a destroyer or a cruiser mission. And if you needed to do air defense, maybe you should sign a cruiser or destroyer to escort along with the frigates. Frigates were nominally directed at anti-submarine warfare as well as anti-surface warfare. And so we're asked our ships really to be jacks of all trades and masters of none these days. And I think that that's also caused problems in the development of new key platforms. If you look at the difficulties that are associated with the Ford-class aircraft carrier now, which is totally a transformational asset that's a huge science fair project from the keel up. And then also you look at the truncated 3-ship Zumwalt class destroyer class, which came in, I think, at about $3.8 billion a ship. Just, again, another science fair project. We really needed this frigate to be a very simple design that was mature, that was well established, and that we didn't tinker with too much in order to keep our costs down. Because coming back to a point you made earlier, if this works out right, we'll be able to buy 2 frigates for the price of 1 destroyer. And that is the ratio that we need if we are really going to grow the fleet quickly. The other things that go with this, and this is a key, and this is one of the reasons why I was so enamored with FREM, is that there's room, there's a space actually behind the bridge on the FREM that's a mission control space that you can use for special forces, or you can use to put teams in to control unmanned platforms. Well, as the Navy begins to look at buying unmanned surface vessels, unmanned aerial vehicles, or even unmanned submarines, who's going to control those? Where will those be controlled from? Well, this particular class of ship has the space already built in and the C4I architecture, the communications architecture, to be that central node of the Navy of the future.
Talk a little bit more about unmanned. This is definitely a flashpoint on the Sea Power Subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee. There are those, myself included, who would like to see us move aggressively towards the development and use of unmanned platforms, particularly unmanned underwater vessels and unmanned surface vessels. But there's a question that a lot of my smart colleagues like Congresswoman Loria raise about how quickly we can do that, whether we even have the tech to do it right now. Just kind of, where do you see unmanned platforms, in terms of that overall 355 ship fleet of the future with a better high-low mix?
Well, first of all, I do think that they have to be part of that 355 plus architecture. They absolutely have there.
So they should be counted. This is something listeners may not know right now. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jerry. They don't really count towards that 355 ship number.
That is correct. They don't. And of course, I've actually written that we have to count the unmanned. And in fact, there's plenty of historical precedent for counting experimental unmanned platforms and so on. We actually counted dirigibles back in the 1920s, and yet we didn't count, for instance, the Langley, which was the first aircraft carrier for the first couple of years that she was in the fleet, because she was too experimental. And yet the aircraft carrier is the center of the fleet today, and dirigibles are either on the bottom of the Atlantic or in, parts of them are in museums. So I think that there's a call for that. Now, that being said, I think we have to move cautiously. There's someone shared this insight with me. Until someone can show me a diesel engine that can run for 30 days without a man monitoring it, a diesel marine engine, the most basic component of an unmanned platform at sea would be its propulsion unit. And yet we really haven't done the tests of putting a diesel on a stand and running it for 30 days and having everyone leave the room and just see how it self-monitors itself and how it will do its own maintenance and how it will communicate that architecture. So if we start looking at basic components like the diesel, like the radios, and you start saying how well do they actually stand up under maritime conditions? The fact is, though, that Wisconsin and the Great Lakes are a great place for the Navy to experiment with those types of things. They're the largest inland seas in the world, and it's a great place, I think, for us to begin doing that experimentation in conditions sort of away from prying eyes.
I've often said we should be practicing amphibious landings on the Upper Peninsula just to remind them that used to belong to Wisconsin, and we will take it back at some point. So I think there's definitely a synergy that we have yet to explore between our lines of thinking here.
As a Hoosier, I am not going to get involved in this Michigan-Wisconsin thing going on. We're just happy to have, our dunes there at the southern end of Lake Michigan. Other than that, we're going to leave that up to you guys.
I married a Michigan grad, if you can believe it, but she's from Green Bay, so she's at least a Packers fan.
Yeah.
Let's get into the debate about carriers, the future of the carrier. Did I see something yesterday that the Navy is shelving a future carrier or a lightning carrier study? I haven't read that article yet. I just saved it. Talk to me about that, and then let's just talk more broadly about the role of carriers going forward.
So there was an article that came out yesterday, someone in reviewing the written replies of the designated nominee, Ambassador Kenneth Braithwaite. In his 138 pages of written replies to questions from the Senate, one of the things he was asked about was the future carrier. And the former acting Secretary of the Navy, Thomas Modly, had set up a Future Carrier 2030 commission to look at a alternative design for the Navy, something beyond the USS Ford, due to the high costs associated with the Ford class carrier and the technical issues associated with it. So this commission had been in place, and full disclosure, I had done some consulting work with that commission, doing some historical research. I no longer have a relationship with the commission or the Secretary of the Navy's office at this point. But during his written reply, designate Secretary Braithwaite made the point that he intended to continue with the Ford class, and then after that news came out, the acting Secretary of the Navy, McPherson, stated that the Future Carrier Commission would be shut down and its work would end. So it looks like the Navy is committed to continuing to build the Ford, despite the fact that still, as I think, only 5 of its 11 weapons elevators are operational at this point in time, and despite the ongoing criticism of the class that's coming from the White House, from the president himself. So that ought to be an interesting conversation going forward. That being said, I do think that there's room to have a conversation about what type of aircraft carrier we actually need, that would get us beyond the Ford class, because I think a lot of things have changed since we designed the Ford back in the late 1990s. The air wing has gone from 85 airplanes in air wing down to 65 airplanes per air wing. We need to look at the future of unmanned aircraft on the carrier deck and what that means for carrier design. And we should also look at cost as a driving factor. We simply cannot afford to be spending $15 billion of the Navy's budget on these single platforms, and we need to find some way of sort of breaking that cross curve.
So to put it in terms of the high-low mix of which you're an apostle, this would amount to putting more resources in the high, potentially at the expense of the low. But I think the critics of the utility of carriers going forward often point to advances in the PLA's rocket force, for example, and the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to kill carriers, to put it very simplistically, for a modest investment of their own resources. You've talked about the problem really being a problem of range of the carrier air wing. Maybe explain that to my tens of listeners.
So I actually, while I was still on active duty, wrote a paper called "At What Cost a Carrier," where I did sort of a cost net assessment of how much it was costing us to build these Ford class carriers versus what the Chinese could get in terms of numbers of missiles for essentially spending the same amount of money. And the ratio is something like 14,000 missiles could be purchased for the cost of one of our new nuclear aircraft carriers. And that's a ratio that's very difficult for us to defend against. I then wrote a subsequent paper where which was called Retreat from Range, which was a study of the declining range, the average range of the carrier air wing over time. During the Cold War, when we first built supercarriers, the supercarrier was designed to carry a large enough airplane that could carry a nuclear weapon deep into the heart of the Soviet Union. That's the whole reason we went to carriers this large. And so that air wing could do, its average range was about 1,100 nautical miles. Today, the range of your carrier air wing is just around 500 nautical miles. So it's in half. And so this has driven us to actually bringing our carriers in closer and closer to land, because the shorter your range, the more times that you have to get the airplane close enough to the target to have impact. And then so we began to emphasize what we call deck cycle time, where how many times can I launch this short-ranged airplane per day in service targets. So one of the arguments I've been making is that we really need to invest in an air wing that has an increased range, and probably the cheapest and most efficient way of doing that is going with unmanned platforms, unmanned combat aerial vehicles that extend the range of the carrier, allowing it to stay outside of the range of the Chinese DF-21 and DF-26 missiles and still be able to hit critical targets ashore. And I think that that's the way the argument should be going. Unfortunately, it's not. The Navy has not really engaged with a reform of its air wing, and that's something I think that we have to continue to encourage them to do.
So correct me if I'm wrong, we have unmanned systems in development right now, the MQ-25, is that it? However, they are being developed as refueling platforms and not the lethal strike platforms that you just described.
That is correct. So the MQ-25, which is going to be built by Boeing, is essentially a mission tanker. So it has the ability to fully refuel 2 F-18 Hornets at about 500 miles from the ship, thus extending their range probably to about 800, 850 miles before they have to turn around and come home. The MQ-25, however, is not a strike asset, so it's not stealthy. It cannot carry the weapons. It cannot go and do the mission itself. So it's an interim solution to extend the range of manned aircraft. The problem with it is I'm not going to send F-18s to hit distant targets. I would probably today send Joint Strike Fighters, and the MQ-25 was not optimized, for instance, to fully refuel two F-35 Joint Strike Fighters. So I think that was a mistake in that. And we also missed an opportunity to buy an unmanned vehicle that could have been both a strike asset and a tanker, which is one of the things I'd been writing about a few years ago. We had a prototype that the Navy had purchased and built, the X-47B, which was an all-aspect stealth aircraft that had about 1,500 nautical miles of range. It could carry about 2,000 pounds of ordnance. We took it off from the aircraft carrier deck. We landed it on the aircraft carrier deck. We did refueling tests with it, but then we shelved those two prototypes and we put them away and really turned our back on an asset that I think we could have gone deep in continuing to develop and to make it a true UCAV to come from the carrier deck and actually be able to strike targets at distant ranges.
I guess just to go back to the carrier point, what troubles me about the idea that we're shutting down the future aircraft carrier study is the idea that it's somehow verboten to even debate these things. And I say that as someone who's supported and will continue to support the role of aircraft carriers in the fleet, though I favor a expansion of the small surface combatants in our fleet, and I don't think it needs to come at the expense of carriers. But do you think this is a response to just political pressure? I mean, it seems, I guess what I'm getting is every time we even talk about things like the Lightning carrier, it's like, oh my gosh, we're committing some sin or we're swearing in church. Why can't we debate these things?
It is the strangest thing, Mike, in that I think that there is a sense amongst leadership that everything is so much at risk. Everything is so much on edge. The budget is so pressurized that now is simply not the time to have this type of debate. We need to rally around and get behind the programs of record, and we all need to come to church and sing the same hymn in order to promote the programs that we're working on right now. And somehow we can have that debate that you're discussing at some distant nirvana point in the future where we have room in the budget or room in the strategic environment to have that conversation. But the fact of the matter is now is the exact moment we need it, because the crisis is coming. For those of us who are historians as well as strategists, we can see the confluence of events, be it demographics, economics, military competition, that's coming with regard to the United States and China. And we need to have this debate to better position the U.S. to perform well in that potential war. And right now we are sub-optimized with what we've got. And so I really think the debate is absolutely necessary now. And I am disappointed and have been disappointed at the level to which the Navy will engage in that debate.
And I think, and what I've said this to the Secretary of Defense, for those who are nervous about engaging in that debate, I mean, look at what the Commandant has achieved with his planning guidance and really talking about very verboten things, but finding a receptive audience because he engaged directly in these debates. And so I think the Navy can do something similar.
I agree, but I'm also been very interested in watching how the stories are starting to come out that have been critical of Commandant Berger. And you can see the interest groups, both within the Corps as well within industry, that are coming out to attempt to undercut the very reforms that he's trying to make. And so this is a classic flashback example, snapback, I should say, against someone who's trying to move a large vested community in a different direction. So I wish him the best, and I'm a wholesale supporter of him, because if we get the Marine Corps to move, that will introduce flexibility that we can consider changes in the Navy's force structure along with the Marine Corps' force structure.
One thing that, if you read John Layman's memoir, Command of the Seas, I think is the title. He's written a few books. You really get a sense for how that competition, the antibodies in the five-sided building, the inertia has always been there, and how difficult it is to make major change, but how dependent it was upon his willingness to make the case for sea power and the fact that Reagan backed him up in making that case. To what extent do you think these changes depend upon the Secretary of the Navy being an apostle for American sea power?
You use the term apostle. I use the term an evangelist. Someone who, first of all, Layman is unique in our post World War II secretaries of the Navy in the sense that he combines being a thinker with also having been a man of action. So we've actually, I think, had 6 or 7 fairly influential SecNavs since 1945. But Layman is sort of the measuring stick by which everyone else looks and measures themselves. But he was a man, who was an active officer in the reserves. He had served in the National Security Council under Kissinger, so he understood the bureaucracy and how to fight bureaucracies. He was also a thinker who's published a number of books and is still publishing just absolutely cutting-edge op-eds even today. And so Layman is sort of this guy who has the ability. Layman had the ability to engage both outside of the building with the public in a dialogue, but also he was a knife fighter inside the building. And when he was thwarted by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and it's a classic example in his book, Command of the Seas, where he talked about that he simply sent a message to the White House and got the president to issue a statement in support of a larger Navy at the very moment that the bureaucracy was trying to undercut Layman's initiatives in the building. He did not get a plays well with others checkmark on his report card, but the fact is he did grow the Navy by some 84 ships during his 7.5 years as Secretary of the Navy and got us nearly to 600 ships. And really, when I look back at the type of leadership that the Navy needs, it needs someone who is so vested that they can explain not only that we need a larger Navy, but why to a broader American public. To be able to go on the TV and do Meet the Press on Sunday morning and explain to someone like Chuck Todd why it is that we really need these larger numbers and why we need more frigates and why we need more carriers or why we need more submarines in a way that's understood, that can be understood by the people watching those shows at home. We haven't had that type of leadership in a long, long time.
That's such a good point. It's been I think the thing I've written about the most in the last 3 years in Congress. And I consider myself part of the problem in that I think it's easy for us who are shipbuilding advocates and sea power advocates just to genuflect at the altar of 355, to extend our religious metaphor, without doing the harder work of sort of laying out in terms of geopolitics, geography, and international politics, and our own domestic economy, why 355. Do you think, I commend Braithwaite for being very candid in his confirmation hearing about the fact that the Navy is sailing in troubled waters, I think the phrase he used. We've had turnover in secretaries of the Navy recently. We've also had a generation of really talented officers wiped out by a variety of scandals. I've sort of provocatively said that had the Chinese or the PLA Navy set out to destroy our Navy, they probably couldn't have done a better job than, Fat Leonard combined with a variety of other crises has done in recent years. Where do you think the Navy is right now in terms of morale, in light of what we've seen with these recent scandals, for lack of a better term?
I think the Navy's in terrible shape with regard to morale, and I also think that we're dealing with the issue that you just highlighted between the Fat Leonard scandal and then the 2017 accidents, which caused us to relieve a number of senior flag officers, some of which were great intellectual leaders of the Navy, and got them out of the way. And even now, I think with the COVID crisis and the ongoing investigation that's going on right now dealing with the TR and how COVID was handled with that particular ship with its port visits and everything, I think there's a threat that we'll see even some more people asked to leave and go home. So the fact is we've lost a generation of intellectual and operational leaders from the Navy, specifically those with deep wells of experience in the Pacific, which is the major area of competition. Admiral Davidson, who is now our Indo-PACOM commander, had been essentially the Atlantic Fleet commander at Fleet Forces Command when he was moved to the Pacific. He's not deeply, his flag tours have not been in the Pacific. And we really need to have that sort of deep well of knowledge there that understands the geostrategic competition. We don't have that, and I think we need to have an honest review of our 1 and 2 stars to find who the smart, brilliant, up and coming ones are, and try to accelerate them into positions. Because right now, I think the Army and the Air Force are in much stronger position with regard to senior flag leadership than the Navy is, and we need to rectify that. In the last year of the turnovers in the front office with the Secretary of the Navy have also not been good for the Navy. We need to get on to having stable civilian leadership and reestablish that balance between civilian and military leadership, which I think, quite frankly, has gotten a little bit confused in recent years. And I kind of bring that back to former Secretary of Defense Mattis, who I think placed a great deal of emphasis on deferring to the 4 stars. And we need to have that balance between military and civilian leaders.
Well, very well said. So we have about 10 minutes left. I kind of want to transition to more fun topics. Not that, I mean, this is fun for us.
This is fun for you and I.
We can nerd out on this all day. Wait, what was your call sign in the Navy?
Great question. So everyone calls me Hayes.
Hayes?
So Hayes. So obviously with my last name and my first name, it led itself at the beginning, someone wanted to call me Jimmy. That didn't stick. But my flight crew began first to call me Purple Haze and then ultimately Hayes. So I can always tell if I'm around someone that I've flown with if they refer to me as Hayes.
So Jimmy went to Jimi Hendrix, went to Purple Haze, went to Hayes. Is that the evolution?
All within about a year's time, first year in VP-10 back in 1990.
I love that. Have you seen, I saw Admiral Harry Harris the other day. He seems in his new civilian life, well, I just saw him online, to have grown a very bizarre mustache. Have you seen this?
I have, and I'm deeply, deeply envious. We call that a deployment stash. And in fact, Mrs. Hendrix in this time of COVID has asked me to actually grow a goatee, which is why my face looks slightly dirty now. We're going to see what this looks like. This is the longest my hair has been since 1983 when I went to Purdue's campus to begin my ROTC. So we'll see. But yeah, Harry's got that stash going. And I got to tell you, I find it hilarious. I've known Harry Harris since I was a Lieutenant JG, and that is the stash that he's wanted all of his adult life.
So did you ever work for him or with him, or were you guys of the same cohort?
We were not. I had an opportunity to go work for him, but I have to tell you, Ambassador Harris has a reputation for being a total workaholic, and so I tended to avoid directly working for Harry Harris because I don't have the energy to keep up with him. He took me out on a run one day and just about killed me, and so I have had I've had reason to sort of I love to work with Harry, but not for Harry.
Okay, but as I choke on my water, what are the best movies about the Navy in your opinion?
Oh gosh, well, I mean, obviously, Top Gun is a cultural icon, and it came out when I was in college and really encouraged me to go naval aviation. That being said,
So where do you stand on the sequel, really quick? Top Gun Maverick. Obviously, there's been some controversy around potential censorship by China taking the Taiwan patch off Maverick's jacket. What are your thoughts on the sequel?
Well, I'm deeply disappointed that Hollywood has caved to China's pressure on that. And anyone who's a naval aviator, recognizes that coat and understands what's happened. And we all think it's sort of a cop out. But does that mean that I'm not going to go see it? No, I'm going to be there as soon as it comes out because, quite frankly, watching just the previews of it makes me feel 20 years old again. So I'm interested in seeing that. I also tell you, I love the movie In Harm's Way, which is a sort of a pseudo bad John Wayne film about cruiser warfare back during World War II. I went to see Midway when it came out last year. I was prepared to be appalled by it, but in fact, I found it a good movie in the sense that anything that causes the American people to engage with what is the greatest battle in the history of naval battles, the Battle of Midway. I'm anxious to have people see that.
I enjoyed Midway. I'll say it was cheesy, but it was good. I mean, it was fun. It was, I don't know. And I didn't know much about the pilot whose name I'm now shamefully forgetting, but then it kind of forced me to go down a rabbit hole. And that guy, I mean, what an incredible story that is.
Yeah, I think you're talking about Dick Webb.
Dick Webb, yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, Navy Cross, only guy to sink 2 aircraft carriers in a day. Something that will never be accomplished again, hopefully. And all the point about that as well is he suffered a debilitating injury, by burning his lungs during that flight, and so he never flew again. Really, sort of a tragedy in that sense. I also tell you, I love Master and Commander, and we'll sit down and watch that over and over.
Never watched it. I need to watch it.
You do, and if you haven't read the books, I'm 10 books during this time of COVID. I'm going through the Aubrey Maturin series again, and I'm 10 books into it over the last 8 weeks. So that's another great book read.
Fiction or historical fiction about the Navy? Would you put, the Caine Mutiny in that? What are some good books for those who are interested in fiction that involves the U.S. Navy?
Oh, anything by Herman Wouk is fantastic, because as a Naval Academy graduate and a guy who served, he gets to the culture of the Navy, but he also gets to other social issues. So Caine Mutiny has a lot of social issues dealing with the place of people of the Jewish faith in the Navy and in American life and so on. That's a sub-theme within that. Also, his 2 massive books, Winds of War and War and Remembrance, which, if you have a summer off, you can go and read those. Those are both tremendous in looking at the vast scape of the geopolitical issues behind the Navy and its role in World War II and the years leading up to it. So Woke is fantastic. I grew up reading fiction like the Horatio Hornblower books and Aubrey Maturin, which are great, that gets at the culture of the Navy and the sense of the sailing ship era and how it continues to influence the way that we think about navies today. And there's a couple of books that were called In Harm's Way, which the movie was based upon. There's another book that I read called The Admiral when I was growing up that really colored the way that I thought about Navy culture and the outsider in Navy culture, sort of the guy who doesn't come from the academy, but has a tremendous impact as he comes up through the ranks.
2 movie questions. How do you rate Hunt for Red? I know you're not a submariner, but Hunt for Red October and Crimson Tide.
Oh, it's not even close. It's not even close. Crimson Tide, I don't watch that often. I think I've seen it once or twice. I cannot walk past a television set that has Hunt for Red October on and not stop and sit down and watch the rest of it. I have the editor's cut of Hunt for Red October. I love that novel that it's based upon so much that it's the only novel I own in 3 languages. I taught myself how to read in French and in German by getting the foreign language versions of those and then reading them. That's how I actually got through my language comps for my doctorate, was with the Hunt for Red October. And I read it the first time as a midshipman on board the USS John C. Calhoun, 600 feet below the Atlantic Ocean in the missile tube alley, which is where I went and hid out to read Hunt for Red October the first time as a young midshipman.
Wow. So you're also a sci-fi fan. We share
Yep.
that. I spoke at a sci-fi conference you had a hand in organizing at the Naval Academy. What are some of your sci-fi all-time favorites?
Oh, I mean, obviously, I read Star Trek religiously as a child. And in fact, one of the first times I actually sat down on the high school bleachers with the girl who became my wife, I was sitting reading the novelized version of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And she was reading.
She continued talking to you.
She was reading Fahrenheit 451. So yeah, we started into a conversation about science fiction and how we enjoyed reading it. I also read Honor Harrington, the David Weber books, which are based upon sort of a Navy setting in the distant future, some 1,000 years in the future, but still with a strong naval motif as you have these great fleets ranging back and forth. Of course, I grew up on Star Wars, going to the movies, and I really enjoy those. But there's a couple other books by David Feintock, which are called the Hope series, that deals with a character by the name of Nicholas Seafort, which actually you would enjoy, Mike, because there's a lot of morality and ethics. It's really a study in the morality and ethics of officers. And I enjoy reading those for the way that he constantly steels himself to make the hard decision that's politically unpopular, but it's the moral thing to do. And I enjoy reading those books very much. And recently I came across a new set of books that's called the Legacy series, Legacy Fleet series, which deals with sort of a war with aliens, and then they had to revert to their older ships because the new ships all get taken out. Sort of a Battlestar Galactica, the Redux theme, in that the high tech of the new ships don't work, but the older ships do. So, anyways, I've been reading a lot of things right now in this time of COVID while I'm also writing.
Well, you have some highbrow books behind you. I see. I think Neil Ferguson's Volume 1 of Kissinger there. I think I see H.R. McMaster's Dereliction of Duty behind you. What are kind of you mentioned at the beginning, books that you need to have at your fingertip for reference? What would those be?
So let's see, Kissinger's Nuclear Weapons, Kahn's Thermonuclear War, Kennan on Russia and the Atom in the West, Wizards of Armageddon. So this is the right beside me. This is the stuff I need immediately. I've got Mahan and Mackinder, Corbett up on the next shelf, Loot Walk on strategy. Here's Friedman's new strategy book, Brody. So I got 3 books of Brody's here. And then as we go back down there, Stavridis, by the way, is right here on this shelf. All my foreign affairs, history of the Navy. Those are my Hornblower and Jack Aubrey books. And then Kennan's got his own thing. Eisenhower's got his own shelf back there, Kissinger. And then a lot of science and technology and economics all the way in the back. But this is my reference library. This is the stuff I pull day in, day out. And all of Norman Friedman's books on the Navy, history of cruisers, aircraft carriers, destroyers. I've got all those in here as well. And I've actually been admiring the books behind you as well, and just seeing how many.
Mine's not organized at all. There's some weird ones in there. I realized that I had Shaquille O'Neal's biography on one of my bookshelves when I did a TV interview the other day, and so I took it off and then I put it back on because I thought it was funny, and I don't know why I still have that book from when I was 16 and obsessed with Shaquille O'Neal. So there's a lot of lowbrow mixed with the highbrow on my shelf. Okay, so final question here. Let's say you come to visit us in Northeast Wisconsin here. We're having a beer, and a young kid comes up to us and says, Captain Hendrix, really admire your career. I'm considering a career in service, both military and I love policy. I want to write. What advice would you have for that young Wisconsinite interested in foreign policy and national service?
First of all, do what you're called to do. As I said at the beginning, my time in the Navy was not a job. In the end, it became a vocation. It was something like the priesthood that I felt that I was called to do, to wear the cloth of the nation and render service to it. It's something that I still miss, the idea of actually being of service, in service to the nation. And so if you feel that call, then by all means do that. That's what the nation needs. It needs people who want to dedicate themselves and their lives really to the betterment of their country and their communities at the most essential level out there. If you're called to do policy and think and read and study, be prepared to be challenged and be prepared to challenge back. I have found that one of the roles that I have served is to be the guy in the room who tells the emperor he has no clothes. That is not the path to becoming an admiral in the Navy or a general in the Army or the Marine Corps or the Air Force. But the fact is if you enjoy that sort of intellectual stimulation, then by all means do it. But make sure that you argue from evidence and not argue from opinion. No one really should care what your feelings are. They want to know what your argument is, and be prepared to take the time to write and footnote and back yourself up if you want to create a solid argument. And then I would tell them to be prepared for an interesting life. And I say that in the terms of the Chinese curse. There's good and then there's bad that goes along with that. It will not be necessarily intellectually comfortable. But if you want to be the man in the arena, coming back to Theodore Roosevelt here at the very end, if you want to be the man in the arena, then jump in, but prepared to have your face be marred with dust and sweat and blood in the intellectual arguments that will follow.
Very well said by Captain Jerry Hendrix. Jerry, thank you for helping us take a new look at the United States Navy and shipbuilding and all manner of other things. Thank you.
Thank you.
The dude,